No, I'm just gonna. Okay, I have it in my notes. Okay, if I could have your attention, please. We should start our program. We have an amazing keynote speaker, and it's really my pleasure, my honor to introduce Michael Clemens. So let me start with just, hey, y'all. It's really great to see everyone, all our friends, Owens conference fans. I've seen you before at Owens conferences. Tower Center groupies, you guys are definitely here. It's awesome. Dallas Fed friends as well. Welcome, welcome to all of you. And for completeness, and we have a new sponsor this year for the Owens conference with this, which is Jim mentioned it, the Mosbacher Institute. So, you know, Jim didn't do it right, so we're going to do it over. And I'm going to say, howdy. Awesome. Yes. So, like I said, it's my great honor and real pleasure to introduce Michael Clemens. He's a brilliant economist. I mean, he's a friend also, but he's a brilliant economist and really one of the world's premier migration scholars. I'm not really exaggerating when I say how lucky we were to get on his calendar for this event. I know he is inundated with invitations and for all things, jobs, events, many things. But he said yes to us, and we are so grateful, Michael. So the organizers, and Jim mentioned, you know, Jim and Raymond and Thomas and I, Michael, we knew that you would be the perfect person to kick off this year's Owens conference. And so from what I understand, Mr. Owens, a prominent Texas banker, was something of a globalist, although I don't think that was a term at the time. You know, he lived a long time ago. But he was already at that time committed to the idea that freer, I don't think there was free trade back then, but there was freer trade in the sense of lower tariffs. He was committed to freer trade. And he understood that, you know, that commerce, that exchange had great benefits for the world and for the United States. And I think, and Michael makes this clear in his work, that the world has made great strides towards free trade. Since the Owens Foundation was founded 7 years ago, we've come a long way on free trade. But there has been much, much, much less and intermittent progress on migration. Certainly, the idea of allowing, accepting, and encouraging migration is really not a thing in most countries. Maybe Canada is the exception. So Michael, your work has shown this, that we're very far from realizing the gains from migration like we've realized the gains from trade. I've learned so much from reading your work. It's so innovative. It's just brilliant. So you've demonstrated clearly that the gains from migration are really large and significant, and we fail to realize them over and over again. So like I said, you are the perfect speaker to kick off our conference this year. Welcome.
How are you? If I speak like this, can you hear me? Great. It's just such an honor to be here. Thank you all for taking this time to talk about the border. And we meet to talk about what's happening at the border at a time of really unprecedented crisis in US policy toward the border. Here's a snapshot of that crisis. This, over the past quarter century, is the number of times per month that people have crossed that border and been ruled inadmissible by federal officials. No visa, no US passport, no border crossing card, no advance parole, no nothing. And that happened 2.5 million times last year, with an all-time record you can see there in the upper right of 10,000 people per day in December. A chaotic situation by any meaningful definition of that word. And that chaotic situation is fueling a political earthquake. Here's the Economist magazine predicting that the situation at the border could shape the outcome of the presidential election. Washington Post polling puts, just in the last few months, immigration as the most urgent issue considered by the average voter in the United States. Some big policy change is coming. That's clear. What's uncertain to me is what that policy change will be and what it should be. Now, if you listen to pundits, commenters, memes, journalists, savvy journalists, they'll tell you what's going on. It's a migrant crisis. In other words, the root cause of this chaos is the decisions of people like these. The Arevalo family from Venezuela, who crossed the border inadmissible last year on July 4th, now living as neighbors of my extended family in Long Island City. And I'm going to make a different claim to you tonight. I'm going to claim that the current chaos is not fundamentally caused by the decisions of these people. It's caused by the decisions of these people. That is a necessary and sufficient condition of the current chaos is the collective unwillingness, and for we Americans in the room, our collective unwillingness to invest in and build lawful, regular channels for migration. And I'm going to give a brief, sweeping, and opinionated survey of economic research, some by Pia, some by me, some by others, in support of that statement. So with a view toward this chaotic situation, what are our options? Concrete options right now. I claim that most of the concrete possibilities fall into one of three categories. The first is the most straightforward. It's one that's popular among my students, popular among my neighbors, popular among Americans, and that is enforce the law. Enforce the law. Close the ports of entry to inadmissible migrants. For inadmissible migrants encountered between ports of entry, detain them fully in holding facilities until their asylum hearings, at which point deport 97 to 99% of them who don't get asylum. If the ruling regime in the country of origin won't accept them, detain them indefinitely. Call up brigades or entire divisions of National Guard troops and recall from overseas active military personnel to deploy across the homeland, doing massive sweeps of public areas and employers into vast prison camps to the tune of millions of people per year. Every detail of what I just said is the explicitly stated policy proposal of a major presidential campaign. Extend the Bullard pedestrian fence from 350 miles to 2,000 miles. If 30 feet isn't enough, make it 40 feet or 50 feet. Above all, enforce the legal framework governing immigration to the United States, which was written by my great-grandparents' generation and has not been meaningfully updated in the last 34 years. Why? Because they understood our needs. They knew about the 1982 Latin American financial crisis. They predicted the 1994 peso crisis. They understood that first 9/11 and then the Great Recession would scuttle the last two serious attempts at reforming our immigration system. They knew about the collapse of Venezuela. They modeled and predicted demographic change in Northern Central America. They understood that the then young Castro regime would still be ruling Cuba. And above all, they correctly calculated and predicted the labor market needs of the United States economy by industry and skill level in 2024. So all that remains is for us to enforce what they designed. Now, you might reasonably be skeptical of whether or not all of that is going to happen. That's something that can be very legitimately debated. My own personal interpretation of US and world history is that a polity with sufficient resentment and fear can feasibly enact nearly any policy. But I don't even want to talk about what could happen if those things turn out to be infeasible. As an economist, I'm more interested in what would happen if they are feasible, if policies of mass exclusion are enacted. If those don't worry you, definitely don't read the research. First of all, don't read the work of Chloe East, Andrea Velázquez, and other economists in the leading journal of labor economics, came out recently, studying past programs of mass deportation. They're focusing on secure communities here, mostly under the Obama administration. Secure communities was rolled out at different times in different counties, and they leveraged that fact to rigorously estimate the impact on labor markets county by county. Secure communities, they estimate, successfully deported about 500,000 workers from the United States who didn't have authorization to be here. They find that for every 10 of those who was successfully deported from a county, US workers' employment went down by 1. And I don't mean one American lost their job and then got another job. I mean that the pool of jobs that US workers held went down permanently by 1, due to the deterrence of formation of new businesses, due to encouraging the exit of existing businesses, due to the concomitant disruption of local agglomeration economies. Certainly don't read the research of Gordon Hanson of the Kennedy School, who studied past hardenings of the border, found that they had null effects on US workers. Don't read my own research in the American Economic Review, finding that mass exclusion of Mexican laborers under the Johnson administration, in the end, essentially caused them to be replaced more by machines than by US workers. And the last recommendation I would make is that you must certainly not read my research in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, estimating the fiscal effect of eliminating an asylum seeker from the United States. The fiscal effect of eliminating the average asylum seeker from the United States is negative on US taxpayers. Why, you might say? Haven't I seen a National Academy of Sciences Commission estimating that for people like that, the flows that they pay in taxes are less than the benefits they receive over their lifetimes? That is a highly rigorous finding. It omits a major fiscal flow that is caused by the presence of a person working with that status, and the large majority of them do work, and that is that they generate capital income for their employers, and that capital income is taxed. And that's not really a conjecture. There are many employers in this room. I guarantee you don't create jobs as an act of charity. You create jobs in order to earn money on your capital, which is taxed, and that additional fiscal flow, which is not accounted for in standard estimates of the fiscal impact, makes the net lifetime impact of people with the same characteristics as typical asylum seekers now have a positive fiscal impact across all levels of government, federal, state, and local collectively on US taxpayers. Removing them takes money away from US workers, from natives through that channel. Now, if any of this disturbs you a little bit, economists saying stuff doesn't tend to disturb most people a lot, but if it disturbs you a little bit, there's a great alternative that's a political winner. And without caricaturing it very much, it's something like develop Latin America. I just spent 2 years in the USAID. This is an idea which is very compelling to many brilliant and highly capable professionals working on development. It's a political winner. It brings together people who are skeptical of migrants on one hand and people who kind of like foreign aid and poverty reduction on the other hand. And they might not usually agree on much, but they can agree on this, that if we can just develop Latin America, there'll be less need to migrate. And not just in the US, by the way, around the region. Here's the just departed president of Guatemala saying that he's going to work with donors to build prosperity in Guatemala and create un muro de prosperidad, a wall of prosperity. That is, prosperity in Guatemala will serve the same function as a wall, by kind of keeping people at home. Now, a skeptic of this enterprise might well ask, look, what exactly is the policy lever that the United States has to foster economic prosperity in countries under the control of the Maduro or Ortega regimes? What exactly is the policy lever that the United States can pull to bring economic prosperity to Haiti, where economic historians of the Madison Project estimate that not only is real GDP per capita in Haiti lower now than it was in 1985, it's lower now than it was in 1945. What is the United States going to do? Invade Haiti and run the government, which if we did that would be the fourth time that the United States has done that in the last century. It's not clear what the policy levers are, but the case for develop Latin America is actually much worse than this. Here again, I'm less worried about what would happen if the policy is not feasibly able to bring economic prosperity to Latin America. I'm interested in the consequences of what would happen if that works. And a half century of social science research, not just in economics, and certainly not just by me, also in political science, also in sociology, also in geography, also in anthropology, finds that economic development is positively associated with rising tendency to immigrate. Here is an entry point to that literature. This is Gallup World Poll data from Honduras. The Gallup World Poll goes to most countries on the earth every year and asks a nationally representative sample of adults a bunch of questions. They ask about income. So that orange bell curve you see is the distribution of household income per capita for respondents in Honduras. The blue line is people who answered yes to all three questions about migration. I aspire in an ideal world someday to migrate. I'm planning in the next year to migrate, and I have taken costly steps to imminently migrate, such as pay for travel. That blue line across the distribution of income is the fraction of people who are about to leave Honduras. And it's not that that goes down or is kind of flat. It goes way up across the income distribution. People who have more money are much more likely to migrate. And it's not just very obvious things like you have more money, you can pay expensive smuggler fees, or if you're migrating regularly, you can pay for airplane tickets and that sort of thing, although that matters. Not just that, but much subtler things like when people get money, they invest in education. And when people invest in education, that raises the gap between aspirations and achievements in the context of a poor country. When people have more money, they're more likely to have international connections, which facilitate migration. They're more likely to have language skills. They're more likely to have lots of things that facilitate migration. And not just that, but the number of people making that decision goes up with development. Here's an illustration of how that happened in Guatemala. This is the demographic transition that was part and parcel of development, successful development in Guatemala. So these are our demographic data from the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. That vertical line in the middle is today, 2024. Everything to the left is real data. Everything to the right is their forecast. And that collapsing red line is child mortality in Guatemala, which started out in 1950 at 250 per thousand. That's a quarter of all children born alive not making it to their 5th birthday. Collapsing, thank God, with development. And when people's children are more likely to survive in Guatemala, as in almost every other developing country, that was followed by a collapse in the fertility rate. The green line is total fertility minus replacement. In Guatemala, as is typically the case, there was a gap there. It took 20 years for total fertility to respond, meaning that around the turn of the century, there was a period where people were still having very large families, but thank goodness those children were not dying. And the consequence of that in the last several years has been a flood of young adults into the labor force. This orange line is the year-on-year change in the number of youths arbitrarily defined as age 20 to 35 in Guatemala, all-time high. So even if the incentives for any given worker choosing to migrate or not hadn't changed, there would be way more people making that decision, and that alone would be causing more migration pressure. Note well, this is an aftershock of development. This is a symptom of successful development, not a sign of continuing poverty in Guatemala. Guatemala emerged from the World Bank's low-income classification to middle income, lower middle income in 1974. It hit upper middle income in 2017. That's successful development. And the demographic transition that produced migration pressure is part and parcel of that process. I have talked about this often, as you might be able to tell. And I have sat with people who have enormous experience and talent, both greater than mine. And they've said to me, Michael, I've talked to migrants. They tell me they're leaving because of poverty. Do you think they're making that up? Obviously, if there were less poverty, they wouldn't be leaving. They're not making it up. It's just look at this graph. If you're talking to migrants, you aren't talking to the poorest people. They're missing from the analysis. Both of those things can be true at the same time. So two of these options, which comprise most of the options we have, I claim, have major limitations in the degree to which they can serve the national interest or even be effective. But there is another option, and it's an option that I have advocated for a lot, and that there's just so much more we can do, and that is to invest in regular channels for migration. So I want to spend the rest of the time you're giving me to say 10 things about regular channels for migration. The first is that the regular channels for migration that we currently have are minuscule. They're a drop in the bucket, and to illustrate what I mean by that, I'll just do a back of the envelope calculation. For 7 countries that have been very important to encounters at the border, the CHNV countries, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Northern Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Fiscal year 2022, people with those nationalities were encountered about 1.2 million times. Vast numbers of people. So ask the question, how many visas could those people hypothetically have gotten? How many visas were available that in principle those people could have received? Total up all the visas that were issued in those countries, not adjustments of status here, that were issued in those countries for them to come here. Include everything, include immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas. I'm excluding just one category, which is immediate family green card sponsorship. Almost none of these people have a US citizen parent or child who can sponsor them to come to the US. That's why they're coming to the border. But throw in all the others. Throw in O1, alien of extraordinary ability. Throw in H1B, visas that are not practically relevant for these people. You still can't get past 34,000 visas total for all 7 of them in fiscal 2022. That's 35 encounters per 1 visa. How about asylum? In that same year, people of those nationalities didn't get 12,000 asylum slots in the US. So that's 98 encounters per asylum slot. Let's just visualize this. Those orange people are the people who didn't just want to migrate, didn't just try to migrate, didn't just get to the border, but actually crossed the border. Inadmissible. The green are the number of visas that existed that they could have gotten, and the purple is the 1 asylum slot that existed for them. To a first order approximation, the lawful channels that we have are almost non-existent. There's no meaningful alternative involving movement that these people have. Lawful channels, regular channels for migration avoid needless death. The UN International Organization for Migration registers 686 deaths in that same year at the border, 2022. Completely needless deaths. And that doesn't even count the number of people who died in Darien, who died crossing Mexico, who died behind the border, who weren't counted by IOM. None of these were necessary. Complete waste. Regular channels are strongly preferred by migrants. I have had very brilliant, very experienced migration economists sit with me on a New York Times panel and tell me, Michael, you don't understand. A lot of these migrants prefer unauthorized migration. What do you mean? Well, they're not tied to an employer. It's much more flexible. You can move around. Social scientists have actually talked to them. Here's a book by Simon Pedro Escara Palacios, who went around Tamaulipas and gathered a sample of men who had actually done both unauthorized migration and H2A migration, and asked them to compare and contrast. This is on the right is a PhD thesis by Jose Roberto Gonzalez. Just to give you a flavor for the findings of these studies, the Gonzalez studies is a group of indigenous people in Michoacan. To give you a flavor of their findings, the title of Gonzalez' thesis is Mil veces contratado que de mojado. 1,000 times better to go on H2 than to go unauthorized. The pay is better, the safety is better, the reliability is better, the dignity is better. Everything is better. So it shouldn't surprise us when in this finding from a paper of mine that's coming out next week at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, in which I study the relationship between an increase in people being allowed through ports of entry and allowed to remain in the US and subsequent unlawful migration. When people have access to lawful channels, they use them. In principle, as an economist, I could think, well, there's a substitution effect that could make people substitute away from the desert into the port of entry, but there could also, in principle, be a scale effect, a pull effect to the border due to the more reliable ability to cross that could have an offsetting effect. In principle, it could fully offset the substitution effect. We don't see that. When more people are allowed through the ports of entry and allowed to remain a lawful crossing in that way does not violate the US civil or criminal law, unlawful crossings decline. They decline a lot and they decline persistently in the months thereafter. They are caused to decline. Regular channels must complement asylum. I'm focused on work visas in this presentation. I talk to people who work with asylum, who are concerned about violence, who are concerned about asylees. I'm not saying anything against that enterprise, not at all. I just want to reiterate this visualization. That purple person down there in the corner is the person who is getting asylum, and 98 other people aren't. So reform the asylum system to double, triple, quintuple the number of people getting asylum by some mechanism. The protection needs of the vast majority of the people now actually arriving at the border are not going to be met. We need some other form of protection for them. And people's lived experience in maybe in the experience of some of you, certainly in my personal experience, is that there's never just one reason to migrate. That's a reductionist view of the migration of people. It's possible to be displaced from a rural area in Honduras by drought into a city where there's violence and then be sent for a better future to live with your uncle in Chicago. And the question is, well, are you a climate migrant, a refugee, an economic migrant, or a family reunification migrant? And the answer is yes. US law can't treat you like that because it's not built that way. But it's uncommon in my experience that people have only a single protection need. When I talk about expanding lawful channels, a lot of people, reasonable people, look at me and say, you're looking at the border and saying, I want more of that? No, we're saying the exact opposite of that. Migration under regular channels is different than unauthorized migration. It changes what migration is. It changes who migrates. Here's a paper by Pia. And is Madeline here too? Tomorrow she is. We have learned from Pia about the self-selection process of unauthorized migrants from Mexico. There's other research by David McKenzie and Hillel Rappaport, two specialists in migration and development. Expanded job opportunities in the US for unauthorized migrants can result in people with lower productivity in Mexico having an incentive to come here and become overrepresented. People with lower productivity become overrepresented among unauthorized migrants. The same thing is not true among people who migrate on a visa. This is ongoing work by Sandeep Sureka, who's doing a postdoc at George Mason University where I sit. Here he's comparing the self-selection patterns in unauthorized migrants, where people with relatively low productivity in Mexico are overrepresented, that's the top dotted line, to people in the Mexican Migration Project data who come on a visa. That pattern is not evident at all. among people who come on a visa. The self-selection of people who come with and without visas is different. Regular channels are not more of the same. They are something fundamentally different. And partly for that reason, regular channels create, and I want to say this slowly, jobs for US workers, create them. Why? I wrote a paper with Ethan Lewis of Dartmouth College, and we studied the H-2B visa, which is the largest outside the farm sector non-college work visa that the US has. It has a tight quota on it, so it is allocated to firms that request it by a lottery, a randomized lottery run by the Department of Labor, partly as a fairness measure to small businesses. We utilize that to basically interview winning and losing firms, which were chosen at random. So you've got something kind of like a pharmaceutical trial going on. And we can rigorously determine what the pure effect on an otherwise identical firm is of getting access to 75% Mexican non-college workers to do hospitality work, to do forestry work, to do seafood packing, to do landscaping work. Just that fact, getting the workers that they requested, causes revenue to expand by 17%, big scale up in operations. And for that reason, there's limited enough substitution between foreigners and natives at these firms that the scale effect dominates the very small substitution effect. And the firms that win the lottery and are able to hire non-college workers employ more US workers. That is, an expansion of the H-2B quota would create more jobs, including low-skill jobs, non-college jobs at these firms. Especially we find in rural areas where the opportunity to substitute is most limited. Regular channels complement enforcement. Regular channels is not something for softies who don't have the spine to do enforcement. Regular channels make enforcement work. Right now, a major presidential campaign is going around talking about the 1954 crackdown at the border. This is Mexican apprehensions at the border in red. And yes, they plummeted in 1954. What is very rarely talked about and is little known is that that crackdown was explicitly, integrally designed to incorporate a near tripling of the availability of visas to low-skilled Mexican workers at the same time. I don't mean by coincidence. I mean, it was deliberately designed that way. And that's the reason it worked, because there was an alternative channel and the incentives to use it were created at the same time. This is told in two histories by Kelly Little Hernandez and Kitty Calavita that are really highly recommended reading for somebody who wants to understand that lawful channels make enforcement work better and vice versa. These are not alternatives. Regular channels reduce crime, reduce the crime rate. This is data in a new paper by Ron Abramitsky of Stanford University. In some graphs going back to 1870 and in these going back to 1940, they're documenting that at every stage of US history, up to and including today, at every level of education, including high school dropouts, immigrants to the US have a much lower incarceration rate than natives. And there's a paper in the annual review of criminology summarizing a ton of research on this. It's really a very, very well-established statistical fact. I am very aware that a lot of people just don't think about this statistically. They hear about a horrific event that occurred due to an immigrant by a victimized family. And they say, if that immigrant hadn't been allowed in, that family wouldn't have experienced this tragedy, and don't you care? To get a vision of what's going on, it's helpful to take a step back from current circumstance and take a historical perspective. So here are some newspaper articles from the shameful period of United States history, the 83 years of Chinese exclusion in the United States between 1882 and 1965. You could peruse the newspapers during that period and hear about police seeking Chinese killer, Chinese crime, police guard Chinese rapist, Chinese killers charge only $10 for each victim. It's a bargain. But watch out for the Chinaman rape fiend. You know, every single one of these and 500 others could be true for all I know. It could be absolutely accurate, each of these individual pieces of information. The sad fact of humanity is that every single social group contains people who occasionally do horrific things. White people and Black people, Spanish speakers and English speakers, documented and undocumented, all of them contain those people. So if someone that you're listening to is focused on telling these stories just about one group, the thing to do is ask, what is the reason why they're targeting that particular group? They could have targeted any group with the same methods, maybe even your group. And when the group that they're targeting is just as guilty as any other group, or even in this case, less guilty, the thing that I ask is, well, what is it that is making a teller of these stories weave carefully selected truths into a collective falsehood? I'll say two more things that are much more optimistic. Regular channels are popular now. This shocked me. It might shock some of you. Pew Research, nonpartisan Pew Research, asked a nationally representative sample of US adults what would make the situation at the US border with Mexico better, and 56% of adults say creating more opportunities for people to legally immigrate to the US would do that. This is not political suicide to espouse these things. This is something Americans are smart, and they understand that this could play a role, even a crucial role, in better policy toward the border. And the last thing I want to say, Pia, is maybe the least understood, as somebody who worked for the last 2 years to try to build some of these lawful pathways. Regular channels are something that you build. Like it's like building a door with hammer and nails, and you have to make a plan, and if you don't do it just right, the door won't hang and it won't open. It's nothing like a floodgate. Not when this cartoon was made in 1903, or when the same metaphors go around now of floods and surges and floodgates, and if you open the door just a little bit, the whole ocean comes in. Regular channels are something you have to carefully construct. Here is, in my view, national hero, Marcelo Escobar, who was a USAID official heading the Western Hemisphere operations, just moved to the White House, going around El Salvador, working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other agencies there to build recruitment systems for H-2 workers to come to the United States, add value at US firms, as I mentioned, create jobs, including for low-skill Americans, displace irregular migration at the border, benefit El Salvador, just do good in the world. But it's incredibly difficult work. It requires investment. It never seems to be the right time to do it. Every generation seems to think that since 1986 and in 1996 and many times since then, we hear that we have to secure the border first, and then we'll talk about lawful channels. Lawful channels have a crucial role in creating order at the border, and that's what I wish was better understood. There are alternatives to policy proposals that might not be in the national interest or that might not work. We have policy options that work, that are politically feasible, that are administratively feasible, and that are welfare enhancing for America and for the region. The first step to getting there is to understand what the root cause of the crisis is. So, thank you very much.
Hey, can you hear me? All right, great. Well, I'm going to turn it over to the audience.
Yes,
Wonderful presentation, Michael. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're just eager to have a discussion with the audience and just see what are your questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thanks.
I think there's a mic.
Beth want to stand up and introduce yourself too. Yes. Do that. Hi, I'm Carolyn Freund from the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. I thought that was excellent and really compelling argument for more legal channels. My question is about developing Latin America. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that development does restrict migration. So one example is just Venezuela. So the reversal caused people to leave. And then it's really about the gap in development. So your country can be growing, child mortality improving, things like that. But if the US is growing faster and there's more jobs here, it's about the differential. It's not about the level. So I just wanted to ask about causal evidence. And then, of course, it's also related at any specific point in time to the costs of migrating. So it just seems like you kind of ran through that part. And I get why you want to do that to get to the point that we really need channels. And I totally agree with that. But I just want a little more evidence on that. Thanks.
Yes, of course. Could I talk about?
Yeah.
What a great point. And you rightly bring a whole lot more nuance to that. So the fact that Pia rightly suggested that I make this much shorter, so I deleted 3 slides about exactly this. The fact that almost no countries over the last 60 years have sustainably raised real GDP per capita without increases in the fraction of their populations living abroad. That is, we just have very few examples of countries that have successfully developed without more migration. Suggests that there's something intimately linked between them. That has nothing to do with saying when there is a crisis, when there is a war, when there is a government collapse, do more people leave? Absolutely. That's a shock off the trend. I'm talking about a long-term process, not would preventing Latin America as a region from losing 7% of GDP in the COVID crisis, which was the biggest regional hit to GDP in the world, would that have prevented more people from leaving? Of course it would, if we're talking about shocks. What I'm talking about is development over the course of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, which is how long it takes to develop. And that is the timescale on which, if countries of Latin America are going to join Chile and Uruguay as becoming high-income countries someday, that's how long it's going to take to get there. And we just don't have many examples of countries that have done that without greater integration, including integration of workers. So what you're saying is absolutely correct, but there's this idea in aid agencies that our mandate is to prevent migration, and it's an experience that we just haven't seen a lot of. You made a second point that I should have written down after Venezuela. Yes, absolutely, and certainly those things are not uncorrelated with each other. Countries that are well integrated with the United States tend to do well when the United States is doing well, when the global economy is doing well. So those are not orthogonal variables, as the economists would say. But it is certainly the case that forces on both sides of the border make a big difference. Here's another example of where policy could have made a vast difference. 1986, there were roughly 3 million people in the United States with no legal status. Under the Reagan administration, massive regularization campaign for those people. The vast majority of them took advantage of it and got regularized. 4 years later, there were more unauthorized immigrants in America. And then after that, it shot up from 3 million to 10 million, 12 million. Was that because IRCA in 1986 actually motivated people to come? Pia's research has taught us, no, that didn't happen. It was just that there were massive forces on both sides of the border driving that migration pressure, and the 1986 reform hardened the border. It contained regularization provisions. It didn't have serious provisions for expanded lawful pathways. And to me, that is the fundamental cause of what happened over the next 10 years, which is a flood of black market migration that
was explicitly referred to in the 2016 presidential campaign and continues to shape American politics and didn't need to happen. Why was that happening? Things on both sides of the border. Mexico in the 1980s was going through exactly that demographic peak that you saw Guatemala hitting just over the last several years, the highest ever growth of the youth cohorts. Coincidentally, at the same time, that the same youth cohort in the United States was shrinking, not just growing slowly, but actually falling year on year as the baby boomers aged out of youth in the 1980s. And there was that huge pressure, huge opportunity for mutual gain across the border. Again, part of Mexico's development. That demographic surge in Mexico in the 1980s was an aftershock of falling first child mortality and then fertility in Mexico down to today's replacement level fertility in Mexico. It was a sign of successful development. All of that said, when the Latin American financial crisis and the peso crisis came along, of course, more people left, but those were blips on a much larger trend. So none of that is to disagree with you, but they're just sort of different phenomena, if that makes any sense. And you rightly bring nuance to the broad brushes that I was using.
Michael, following up on Caroline's question, were some of the slides about El Salvador? I'm not sure, the ones that you cut, but could you talk about, I mean, I think what's happening in El Salvador may speak a little bit to causes in terms of conditions in the origin and the destination. Can you elaborate?
Oh, the slide with a Salvadoran man named Balmore brandishing his H-2B visa was just in a very different direction, which is that there are a whole lot of people, especially labor advocates, who just don't like H-2 visas. And they don't like H-2 visas for very good reasons, because they're highly problematic. They tie workers to employers, which is a recipe for problems. They are the tool that we have for lawful channels at the moment. And until a top to bottom reform of US immigration law, that's what that was about. It was, but I'm interested in what
I'm interested. Well, I'm curious because is it Bukele? Is that his
Yes.
name in El Salvador? And he's sort of put all the gang members and other innocents probably in jail, but he is apparently, and I know some Salvadorans, and they're very excited about just how just peace and tranquility that's there now. And they're saying people are opening their businesses back up, and there's
Yes.
commerce, and there's just a renewed hope about life and the economy in El Salvador. So would you expect that to reduce some of the pressure on migration, or how do you see that?
It absolutely could, and you really highlight how difficult it is to disentangle migration due to violence and migration due to economic reasons. Violence affects the economy and vice versa, and when violence is reduced, that can create job opportunities that deter people from migrating, and that can be part of the effect of violence. Whenever I talk about employment-based lawful channels, people often think that I'm somehow denigrating the people who are claiming asylum, as they're all faking it or something like that. It's just that these things are deeply, deeply intertwined. And absolutely, when there's just more hope in general for a better future for your kids, people are less likely to leave. However, in past experience of development, there just aren't many countries that have gone from low income status. I'm talking about several hundred dollars per capita in real GDP per person per year, to around 8,000, 9,000, 10,000, like Colombia level. There are almost no countries that have gone through that transition without more integration of labor, of people. And that's higher skilled workers and lower skilled workers. So the idea that somehow in a time scale that is meaningful to politics, an aid agency is going to develop Honduras in a way that will actually cause a long-term sustained reduction in migration pressure.
So they didn't listen to you, is what you're saying. You were there. You were.
that's optimistic. It might have been that my saying it actually caused them not to do it. So it's more of an anti.
There's always that. Great. Next question. Great. Go ahead. Oh, we need a microphone.
Okay, thank you. Ray Turbany, Dallas. I'm interested in your discussing people with mid skills. and their migration to the US. I read something called I think it's called global skills partnerships, where countries, like two countries would get together and the destination country would send materials and teachers to establish training centers in the their country of origin. And then they were expected to come to the US. I haven't read what's anything happened on that. What do you think about it?
You must be a plant of some kind. So I coined the term global skill partnerships and I conceived of that policy design at the Global Economic Symposium in 2012, and I've been advocating for it all over the world. Yes, thank you. You could not have possibly set me up better. It's global migration has this conundrum, which is when it's low skill, destination countries get suspicious of it. When it's high skill, origin countries get suspicious of it. What do you mean you're taking our best and brightest? And the mainstream solution, which is very poor solution to that policy conundrum in international circles, like the UN, has always been circular migration. You know, people will go for a little while and come back. That's not how many people want to live their lives. They move and then they initially thought they'd stay for a little while. They end up staying their whole life. I have some experience of that in my immediate family. There has to be a way to do it better, and design global skill partnerships exactly for that reason. Could there be a bilateral agreement in the context of important migration corridors in which destination countries get involved in a public-private partnership so that employers are getting precisely the skills that they need, informing the human capital that is needed at that moment by employers that they will be using and benefiting from? In other words, not taking human capital, but unlocking the power of migration to create human capital, to create incentives for the formation of human capital. The idea has been piloted in between Belgium and Morocco. There was a successful global skill partnership for IT workers to be placed in Flanders. The German government has ongoing global skill partnerships with Morocco, Tunisia, and they're developing them with 3 other countries. So it's an experimental program. Yes, I was not able to convince the administration in my 2 years working directly with the administration to build a global skill partnership in Central America. It's incredibly difficult because fundamentally because the visas aren't there. We don't have a visa that that the administration can grant to respond to migration pressures. Long story behind that, we had an explicitly racist immigration policy for a long time in this country, and in 1965, that was dismantled by putting every country on the same footing. Nepal and Honduras, under immigration law, are on the same footing. There's no regional component to with many exceptions, the TN visa under NAFTA and that sort of thing. But by and large, giving preference to a particular nationality, even if it is very important to responding to regional migration patterns or specific events in certain countries, just is not part of the 1965 law that continues to govern us. There's parole, there's temporary protected status, other things have been cobbled together to respond to regional challenges. But the ability of Joe Biden to say, you should give 5,000 visas to nurses trained in Honduras to come to Texas and serve in hospitals doesn't exist, and it would require a major immigration reform to do it. Those visas do exist in Australia, in Canada, in Germany. And for that reason, a lot of the innovation in this dimension has been going on there and not in the United States. So we lack the technology to implement what I think is a wonderful idea, and I really appreciate your bringing it up.
Michael, what happens? You made a point to describe, 2.5 million encounters at the border last year. Many of those paroled into the country either as parolees from Venezuela, from Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti. Others, asylum seekers that you made the point of saying they're not going to get their asylum claims approved. What happens to them?
My gosh, You mean people who are already here?
Yeah, they've been let in and they, either as parolees or as asylum seekers, their asylum claims are going to be denied. Then what happens after that?
There's very little, just as an empirical question, there's incredibly little data on that, on people's transitions from asylum seeking to other statuses, including no status at all. I've never seen a study. There are people who work on the ground who have a sense of what's going on, but statistics in my experience are just completely absent. I've tried to study asylum seekers to the level of what's the average age, gender, anything. There's no data set on them as a class, much less what becomes of them. But yes, parole is a time delimited status. Lawyers are going to get upset if I call it a status. Is a time delimited
You're not in court.
a time delimited document. Humanitarian parole is my understanding is technically most of the asylum seekers are on conditional parole, which is until their asylum hearing, and then it goes away. At the time of the hearing, if the hearing doesn't go in their favor, which for the vast majority it has not been going in their favor, or at the end of the time delimited humanitarian parole, what's going to happen to those people?
Do they become part of the undocumented population? Do they get deported?
They will become deportable immediately upon the expiration of either of those statuses.
Most
It
likely.
would be speculative for me to even suggest what will
Yeah.
happen to them. If I had to guess, it would be that most of them will stay, even without status. It's really something that I wish the public understood better is a lot of people don't like the term illegal immigrant because of its ethical implications, because
Right.
of its normative implications. To me, it's not a useful factual term. Somebody coming to a port of entry and being not admitted, because that's a technical legal term, but allowed to enter and being given a document that says you can't be deported for 3 years, which comes with employment authorization, which in most states makes you eligible for unemployment insurance, and you're eligible for Affordable Care Act subsidies, looks nothing like what people think of when they think of somebody sneaking across the border and living in the shadows and having no status at all. But both of them somehow are called illegal immigrants. I think separate from the other concerns you might have about that term, it's just not a term to use because it's not a meaningful description of a lot of people's status. I actually learned from a lawyer what the technical legal term is, prucol, or person residing under color of law. This legal doctrine going back to the 13th century, in which reflecting the status of a person who is explicitly allowed by people empowered to enforce the law to do something which technically they are not supposed to be doing. And it is a gray area between legal and illegal, but whatever it is, illegal is not an accurate term to describe them. So that's why you noticed my insistence on using technical language like inadmissible, which is
Inadmissible, but granted entry.
yes, or residing under the color of law. Those are technically correct terms, but illegal isn't.
Next question.
Great data. My name is David Cam. I came here as a foreign student a long time ago. So I came in for college and I got my degree and then moved on to graduate school. So I earned 2 engineering degrees and I joined a well-known, Fortune 500 great company. The question I have is when I apply for the immigration visa as a very high skilled labor, my status from my country was I think either 11 or 13-year wait. And at that time, I think it was during the Reagan years, but could be wrong. But there was an amnesty that went on for illegal immigrants, and they pretty much get immediate permanent residence, and we have to keep waiting and waiting and waiting. And there was a lawyer in Houston who actually quoted us to try to find some way to to have some foreign student violation during our years in college to classify us into a illegal status to get us, faster on fast track. That didn't work. But anyway, my real question is, it seems like politicians like to use this illegal immigration more as a political, I guess, way of dealing with powers more than really fixing the immigration issue. So I like your mentioning of regular channels. So moving forward, do you see this southern border crisis will also be more focused than a full immigration overhaul? You understand my question?
It's 2007 was the last time that we had a serious chance at an immigration overhaul. I'm 52, so 2007 seems like yesterday to me. 2007 was a long time ago. All of this time.
Oh.
How it turned on. How about this? How about now? The lights on. Thank you. Thanks very much. Oh, can you hear me now? Yes, 2007 was a long time ago. That's the last time there was a serious attempt at immigration reform, and it failed completely. It never even passed the House. I don't know what it would take to get a serious immigration reform, but one thing that really strikes me about the history of attempts at immigration reform is that in 1986 and 1996 and 2001 and 2007 and 2008 and many times since then, and today, right now, this week, the public discussion revolves around first secure the border, and only then can we have immigration reform and a lasting deal and lawful channels for migration. That's just terribly, terribly misguided. The 1986 reform that you referred to and the remarkable unfairness that I really sympathize with of what you watched happen to other people faced with while you were having to wait. I've had relatives in the same waiting game. Why was that happening? Why were there so many unauthorized immigrants in the United States in 1980s? When the United States killed the Bracero program at the end of 1964, December 31st, and then in 1968, for the first time ever, imposed a quota on immigration from Mexico. Before that, under 1965 and the 1924 immigration laws, there was no quota on immigration from Mexico. Now, for the first time, there was. Both of those closures resulted in, under the extreme demographic pressure that I mentioned before, the huge wave of unauthorized migration to the US. And that's what created the problem that had to be dealt with by the regularization, with all of its problematic consequences, unfairness to Mexicans, unfairness to non-Mexicans. There's some really poignant letters from Mexican diplomats around the time that Johnson killed the Bracero program saying, don't you understand this is going to result in a vast wave of black market migration to the United States? And it exactly played out as they suggested. Everybody interprets history to say that they were right all along. And you might detect a note of that now, but it's really, it was widely understood at the time, particularly by Mexican diplomats and academics, that what happened in the 1980s was going to happen and that it was a product of US policy decisions. I had a professor in undergrad, Ted Scudder, a brilliant anthropologist, who always used to tell me, Michael, I'm an optimistic pessimist. I think there is a solution. I just don't think we're going to get it. That's how I approach these policies. It's very clear that at several moments of history and still today, lawful channels would make the situation better. I showed you that most of the American public believes that they would make the situation better. It's not a moonshot. It could happen. But But the inability of our policymakers that I have held up before you as the villain of this evening to get it together, to do their job, to move us forward from decades old, really drastically outmoded rules and regulations is something that is difficult to have faith in. And I wish I could strike a more optimistic note than that.
Thanks, Michael. Let's turn to Jim.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Pia. Maybe devil's advocate, but I think I want to push you on the danger of moral hazard. I don't know if everyone in the room understands this concept of moral hazard, but I'm sure there are people here, and if we had a broader selection of the American electorate, you'd have a lot more skeptics. The idea that, you know, opening up for more legal immigration will somehow, you know, restore control at the border, and that it will lead in the long run to lower levels of migration seems counterintuitive. So could you, how do you address the moral hazard argument?
I don't think it would result in the long run in lower levels of migration, but lower levels of illegal migration for sure. And there we have many examples on both sides of that. We have the huge expansion of lawful visas in 1953, 1954 that just unquestionably, not by themselves, but when bundled with a step up in enforcement that encouraged, that created more of an incentive to use those channels for employers and migrants, unquestionably for a decade, greatly increased the security of the U.S. border. So there's a very clear policy experiment. I would argue that the reverse of that policy experiment happened, or a related policy experiment happened between the years 2000 and let's say 2019. That was a 10-fold expansion of the H2 program, which H2A on agriculture has been 94% Mexicans, H2B has been 75% Mexicans. So it is to first order a Mexican work visa. During that time, apprehensions at the border went way down. And some of the same people were shifted out of unauthorized status into authorized status. In the Mexican Migration Project data, which is available on Princeton's website, you can download it, look at the people who migrated to the US on an H2A visa in the last 10 years. They have their whole migration histories for all of them. And for 34% of the people who came on a regular visa, you can find a prior trip unauthorized. That is, the availability of a regular channel moved that person out of unauthorized crossing into authorized. The idea that none of this means less migration. I am not a person who believes in central planning. I think that the global experience with centrally planned economies suggests that it didn't go very well, and that government bureaucrats, no matter how well educated, are not very good at calculating how many iPhones Americans are going to need 3 years from now, are much worse at calculating how many nannies or elder care workers or landscaping workers or seafood packers America is going to need 5 years from now. What I think that we can do is interpret current evidence to ask which side of the optimum we're on and make marginal changes for marginal improvements in welfare. To me, there is a huge opportunity now, certainly in the hottest labor market in my entire lifetime, and I'm 52, for mutually beneficial exchange between more migrants at all skill levels and Americans, owners of labor and owners of capital, that they could complement in this country. But how many immigrants there should be, or what the optimal policy or optimal level of migration could be, is something that I claim not just I don't know, but is unknowable.
Let's turn to our students.
Hi, I'm Emery Woodruff.
Hi.
I'm a student here. My question is, you kind of mentioned the problematic nature of H2 visas and that they tie employees to employers, which creates all sorts of dangerous issues.
Yes.
How do you recommend that we create legal pathways for low-skill workers without tying them to employers through those sponsorship programs?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not passing, but it still could pass. U.S. Farm Workforce Modernization Act has a pilot project in the act that would allow limited mobility between employers, between farms for H-2A workers. It could all be opened up so that people could move between employers. How do I know that? Because Korea does this. Korea has a huge guest worker program called the Employment Permit System, EPS. They have bilateral agreements with, last time I checked, there were 17 countries. Surely there are more now, bringing Filipinos and Bangladeshis and Laotians and all kinds of workers to Korea to do semi-skilled jobs in factories and that sort of thing. They don't tie to employers. Imagine that. They don't stranglehold migrant workers out of the fear that maybe hypothetically they could affect anybody's employment. They allow you to quit twice. You go to an employer where things aren't working out, they're cheating you on wages, you just don't get along with them. You can quit, go back into the recruitment pool and get placed somewhere else. And you can do that one more time. And if you try to do it again, they say enough. Just like serve out your time. It's a reasonable compromise between mobility and immobility. And the sky didn't fall. Nothing bad happened in Korea. Korea, with fertility, not just not replacement at 2.1, but last time I checked is 0.78, desperately needs those workers. They're massively benefiting Koreans, and allowing them to work between employers improves the match between employer and employee, raising their productivity, raising their contribution to Korea. There's absolutely no reason, administrative or economic, why we need to do guest work in the way that we've done it since the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. It's totally unnecessary. There are other examples. Israel has a program that does not tie workers to employers. It's something that we have done for historical reasons that's politically difficult to change, but can and should change. And it would make those programs more beneficial to America. It would, out of the fear of what some of those mobile employees might do, we're really foregoing their potential benefits. And as you mentioned, we're really creating by policy choice a lot of the problems that labor advocates and activists rightly highlight in those programs. It's just really sad and unnecessary.
Thank you, Michael. We'll take one last question and then we'll let you go. Hiroki.
Thank you very much. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi, political scientist teaching here at SMU. Welcome to SMU.
Thank you.
My question is regarding from your first slide of inadmissible migrants. It seems that from 2008 to 2016, it's actually stayed low. Is it somehow related to Obama administration's policy, or it's nothing related to any American policy?
Thank you. So one, to me, compelling data point in favor of not related to policy is that it was predicted in advance. There's a paper by Gordon Hanson, who I mentioned, and Craig McIntosh called The Great Mexican Immigration, in which they, with demographic and economic modeling, forecast that as Doug Massey in sociology and others had said for long before that there would be a decline in Mexican migration pressure right around the 2000 to 2010 period. It seems like the straw that broke the camel's back was in 2006, when before the Great Recession, the bottom fell out of the housing starts and there were a lot fewer construction jobs, and all of a sudden there was a big negative shock to Mexican migration. But already from demographic change and other reasons, there was and then the subsequent unemployment after the Great Recession really killed it off. But that was the tail end of a long drop, and it stayed low for a very long time. And since Gordon Hanson and Craig McIntosh said I think it's in Restat,
Yeah.
the Review of Economics and Statistics, long before Obama came to power, that this was going to happen. It makes me suspicious that you could attribute a large portion of it to policy. What happened since then is very different. Encounters with Mexicans at the border went way up after 2020. And I don't think good papers have been, well, I don't want to smear anybody's work. I think there's a lot of
More can be done.
there's a lot of good research that remains to be done on why that happened. I have my own suspicions about what Title 42 expulsions did to the incentives of migrants to attempt entry, including illegal entry. There is a paper by my former RA, Sammy Bazzi, pointing out that efforts to increase the criminal consequences for illegal entry, known as the consequences delivery system that rolled out by DHS from 2000 to 2008. And here's a point in favor of policy, actually reduced quote unquote recidivism at the border, and therefore played a role in reducing encounters at the border. So I'm not saying the role of policy is zero. Title 42, in essence, repealed that, because if somebody is expelled immediately and not processed for deportation, there aren't any criminal consequences. So the Title 42 deportees could just turn around and try again, and frequently did try again and again and again until they just got in. So the reason for the rise to the right of that graph, including among Mexicans, where it really looked earlier like demographic change had played out and Mexican apprehensions would be low for a very long time, and that radically changed in 2020. Is we need to understand better, and Pia, you probably understand it much better than I, but I don't think it's well understood. I think that politicians talk about policy. Politicians have a very strong incentive to overstate the effects of policy on what's going on. The greatest example of is when presidents talk about I created these jobs or didn't create these jobs. They're not who's creating the jobs. But really the generational forces that have shaped that shaped the great Mexican migration from the 1970s through 2006. And that, as I pointed out in those data from Guatemala, and there's similar data from around the region, are now shaping migration, are something that's just far beyond the ability of policy to affect. We can respond to it and shape the terms on which it happens. We can drive it into the black market. We can make sure that lots of people die while it's happening, or we can make sure that it happens in the way that's most mutually beneficial. But making it happen or not happen, or developing Honduras so it doesn't happen, these are things that are far beyond the ability of policymakers to enact.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you very much. Thank you.